Do you currently own the Festool Domino? Do you sometimes have trouble getting perfectly aligned panels for your carcass builds on all of your projects? If you answered yes to either one of those questions, then stick around in this video as I show you how to make this domino layout jig for all of your upcoming projects. Hey, I'm Ben and welcome back to Tool Tip Tuesday, a weekly video segment where I share tips and tricks that will hopefully help you out in the shop this week in only 2 minutes or less. Today I'm going to show you how to make this simple measuring and marking jig for the Festool Domino. This is going to come in handy when marking your panels for the domino layouts. Using it not only reduces the amount of time it takes to mark and measure my own panels, it helps reduce the error because I'm using the same reference points every time I draw a mark. There are just two components to this design. You have the reference rail and the marking gauges. Now, parallel rips with this gauge are critical to attaining the accurate, consistent marks. The ends of the marking gauge right here must be parallel to the reference edge. So what that means is as you line this up against whatever the edge of the panel, you want to make sure that these marks are going to be parallel to this reference edge, because we're going to then take this to another panel and mark it maybe in a different orientation, or vice versa. So again, parallel rips and perpendicular cuts on this gauge are very important in order for this to be effective and to give you accurate marks on your panels. This gauge can be used with other joining reinforcement methods such as dowels, biscuits, pocket holes, and when you want fasteners like screws to be aligned. When I first purchased the domino a few years ago, there were some occasions when my mortises for the dominoes were either slightly askew or completely off. This vacillation between measuring tape and square ruler and marking not only took more time, but it also introduced more errors. I eventually came up with this simple and effective design that was not only easy to use, but easy to make as well. The scale for marking is based off of reference edges on your panels, so it doesn't really matter what size you make these gauges. This jig can be made from plywood or any other hard material that is dimensionally stable. I wouldn't recommend using stock thinner than 18 millimeters, as this limits the amount of surface area when marking edges, but that's just a personal preference. If you want detailed instructions on how to build this jig, you can use the links below in the description to go to my website and download these plans for free. Although I have my marking gauge set at 100 millimeter increments, you can do this at whatever measurements you want, just based off the tools and the materials that you have on hand. All right, with the design talk out of the way, let's go ahead and throw 2 minutes on the clock and get started with this build. Using parallel guides and a track saw, I ripped some 18 millimeter red oak plywood into two 50 millimeter strips. Next, I used the miter saw to cross-cut these strips into the final dimension pieces. Using the flag stops on the Capex trimming attachments made this step super easy. After cleaning off the first end, I cut the reference rail to 500 millimeters, and then marking the gauges to 250, 350, 450, and 550 millimeters. After cross-cutting all my pieces, it was time for final assembly. Starting with the shortest gauge, I applied some wood glue at the end and with a few dabs of CA glue. I sprayed the activator on the reference rail and then used a square to ensure proper alignment while holding the pieces together for around 30 seconds. With the first gauge held in place, I flipped it over and reinforced the joint with some wood screws after piloting and countersinking for each screw. Attaching the gauge from the underside was more of an aesthetic decision to hide the metal fasteners. Functionally, it doesn't matter if they're on the top or the bottom. With the first gauge now installed, I applied glue along the joining edge and repeated these steps for the other three gauges. I used my MFT top and a few clamps to hold the pieces flat while the glue dried. After an hour, I removed it from the clamps and used a sanding block to break the sharp edges where my hand and fingers rest on the jig. With the jig now completely assembled, it was ready for use. Well, that's going to do it for this 2-Minute Tuesday. If you found this helpful, make sure you give it a like. If you want to see more content like this, make sure that you subscribe to this channel. If you want the free detailed plans on how to build this jig, make sure you use the links below. Download it for free. That's going to do it for me. Until the very next video, have a good day.